Hello, my name is Roman Dzindzihashvili, and this is video from the series of world greatest players. Of course, series of world greatest players can never be done without including one of the greatest players ever, Aleksandr Alekhine, or Alekhine, as in the Russian spelling. That's how he spelled his name. Alekhine was born in 1892 in Moscow, Russia. At the age of 20, maybe he was already a very strong player at the age of 15, 16. At the age of 20, in his early 20s, he was considered as the best player in the world. And he was extremely strong positional player. And a lot of positional aspects of the game were not known nearly as well as they are known now. And that's why Alekhine, when he played, he used all these positional aspects of the game the best way they can be used now. Of course, regarding opening theory, he had some of his own inventions, but opening theory was on an extremely low level in the beginning of the century. So that's why when he was playing white, if white played d4, there was only one move practically for black, was d5. There was no king's Indian, queen's Indian, ninja Indian, or Slav defense. Those openings did not that they haven't been studied properly. They didn't exist. So Alekhine started developing them. He was born in Russia, but he was living most of his life in France. After winning world championship title in 1927, Alekhine was then 35 years old. Shortly after that, he made a statement about Russian Bolshevik movement, and he was denouncing it. And shortly after winning him world championship, Krylenko, that's a person who was in charge of Soviet Chess Federation, he pronounced Aleksandr Alekhine as enemy of the Soviets, because Alekhine made these statements about Bolsheviks. And whatever Krylenko said, of course, never came from him personally. It came from the government. And Alekhine was living in France then. And from then until 1930, Soviet Chess Federation cut all the contacts with Alekhine. But that didn't bother him to win almost every strong tournament. And there were only strong tournaments then. There were not too many tournaments played in the world. And if there is any volunteer to organize some big tournament, sure enough, all the best players would play there. So chess was introduced to Aleksandr Alekhine by his older brother, who was 7, 8 years older than him, and his older sister, Barbara, and his mother. His father never took part in Alekhine's chess development. And after Krylenko denounced him as enemy of the Soviets, his brother actively was protecting him, Alekhine's reputation, and was defending him actively. And for that, in 1930, he was killed in Russia. Well, now going back to Alekhine's career, Actually, he was killed in 1939. Well, Alekhine won almost every chess tournament there was played. He defended his title twice against Bogolyubov, another very strong Soviet player. And so he was one of the few, and maybe the only world champion who died. Actually, he died in the age of 53 in 1946, while holding the title of world champion. So that makes him one of the greatest players that ever lived. When I make series on the best chess players that ever lived, I like to pick some games that were not nearly as well known as their most important games. For example, I could do a couple of games. He had great games in his World Championship match against Capablanca, against Bogolyubov, and for example, against Botvinnik or Keres, or against Fine. But I picked games that are not so well known, but show in a flash what his strength was. And his style was the most progressive and active style. Well, let's look at the game that Alekhine played in 1922 against Frederick Yates in London. Actually, d4, that was knight f6 played. But as you see, either though it was knight f6 first move, the opening still was Queen's Gambit declined. As I already mentioned, the only opening that was ever played at that time against d4. c4, e6, knight f3, d5, and knight c3. Sure enough, we got to the Queen's Gambit declined. After knight c3, bishop e7, bishop g5, castle, e3, knight bd7, and rook c1. Those are the main moves of the Queen's Gambit decline that were played then. And it was considered that any other move from either side would have been a mistake, which is, of course, is not true, and we know it now. So after knight b to d7, rook c1, c6 was played, queen c2. White is not in a hurry to develop their bishop on f1 because they wait when black takes on c4. So black didn't do it. They played rook e8, bishop d3, and now black takes, bishop takes c4, knight d5, and knight e4. f5, in my opinion, is, well, it's not in my opinion. I can almost, with a confidence, said that f5 today would be considered as a big positional mistakes because dark square bishops about to be exchanged. Bishop takes e7, queen takes e7. And black put another pawn on a light square, and you see their bishop on c8 is very passive. And e5 square becomes potentially weak. After exchanging bishops, knight e to d2, this is much better square than g3 because from d2, knight may go to c4 and e5 or b3 and c5. This position is already worse for black. So b5 was played. That's another pawn put on white square. That's also positional mistake. Bishop takes d5, cd. Give this position to any decent player today. They will say this is absolute nightmare for black. It wasn't considered so in 1920s. After bishop takes d5 and cd, castle, a5, and white heading towards the weak squares, c5 and e5. There is knight on d7 that protects both squares, so once white exchanges this knight, position will be completely lost. Knight c5, knight takes c5, queen takes c5. Now, Frederick Yates was one of the best players at that time, but even him, I don't think he even realized how bad was his position. Queen takes c5, rook takes c5, b4, rook fc1. White is completely dominating the c file, the e5 square. Black's position is totally lost. Bishop a6, knight e5, rook e to b8, f3. And just to see how precise was the execution of this position, b3, a3, h6, king f2, king h7, h4. And here we're going to see a bunch of senseless moves by black, not because they played bad from this position, because there are no sensible moves. Rook f8, king g3, slow squeeze continues, king goes to f4, rook f2, b8, rook c7, bishop b5, rook c5. Black is totally paralyzed. Bishop a6, rook c6, rook e8, king f4, king g8, h5, bishop f1, g3. Every piece of white is much, much better placed than black's corresponding piece. Knight on e5, both rooks and king. g3, bishop a6, rook f7 to double rooks. Black cannot play rook c8 because bishop hangs. They cannot play the other rook on c8 because pawn hangs. So that's why king h7, rook c to c7, rook g8, and now very interesting maneuver, knight d7, king h8, knight f6, rook g f8, and now very cute finish. Rook takes g7, rook takes f6, king e5, and black resign because the rook on f6 is hanging, and the only way black can save the rook to play rook f8 with one rook or the other, which makes no difference at all because f8 square is taken and now followed by instant mate. This was good example of positional style Alekhine was playing and crushing his opponents left and right. This was beautiful positional style. Today, played by average master, this can be like a normal regular game. For that time, in 1922, that was considered a masterpiece. This game was played considerably later. It was played 12 years after the game we just saw, but the opponent was also a lot stronger. It was Emanuel Lasker. It was played in Zurich, Switzerland, and Alekhine was white. As I already mentioned, that's the only opening was played, since Alekhine was always d4, well, not always, but most of the time d4 player. There is only one opening that was considered against the 4. Knight f3, bishop e7, bishop g5. Well, castle on knight d7 transposes to the same position, e3, castle. We have identical position from the game we just saw. Rook c1, c6. Alekhine played in the last game queen c2, and in this game he played bishop d3, which doesn't change the type of the game. dc, bishop takes c4, and knight d5. After knight d5, bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, and knight e4. Well, it's interesting. I don't know if Alekhine would have played knight e4 move against someone weaker than Emanuel Lasker. He probably would have played a castle here. And the reason why, because he would have avoided queen b4 check, which after queen d2 and queen takes d2, well, taking with the king or with the knight, gives white slight advantage. Well, actually advantage, but I don't think he would have wanted to exchange queens against a weaker player. So he played knight e4 against Lasker nevertheless. And after knight e4, in this position, knight 5 to f6. Knight g3, e5, castle, and here black has choices to go e4, which after knight d2 will give white better position, considering that e4 may be a weak pawn, also possibility of playing f3. ed was played. Knight f5, queen d8, knight f3 takes d4, and knight e5. It looks like black is okay, but in reality, I analyzed this game a long time with the help of powerful engine, and after bishop b3, bishop takes f5, knight takes f5, white is considerably better here. Black has no weaknesses, and black is developed. However, the powerful bishop on b3 and potentials of bringing knight on d6, creating more weaknesses, attacking b7 and f7 square, could be very, very serious. So that's why after knight takes f5, Lasker didn't like exchange of queens because b7 pawn becomes weak after next knight d6. So he preferred to keep the queens on the board and bring the rooks quickly to get the d file against white's queen. After queen b6, automatically white has nearly decisive advantage, which is very, very hard to predict or envision here. Queen d6, attacking e5 knight. Well, knight d7 was played. See, the strong player will never make knight d7 move in this position unless it's the only move. And this is the only move, knight d7. Player of Lasker's caliber would never make this move otherwise. Let's see why this move is the only move. knight is hanging. Knight g6 will give decisive advantage to white after knight check. King cannot move because knight takes f7. And after taking, this position is absolutely horrible. Another interesting possibility would have been rook f to e8, which looks like a blunder, but it isn't. Knight e7 check, king h8, queen takes e5, and knight g8. Now, all black needs for full happiness is to take on e7 with the rook. But after knight d5, this is forced, and white has extra pawn for absolutely no compensation. And also they're connected to pass pawns. This was not an option either. So that makes knight e to d7 the only move. And here rook f to d1, rook a d8, queen g3, g6, and queen g5. King h8, stopping knight h6 check. Black is extremely uncomfortable here. Knight d6, king g7 was played. But is there any other move besides king g7? Well, I don't think so, because f7 is hanging and there is no piece can protect it. After king g7, unfortunately, Alekhine missed here continuation that was mentioned by Rybka that would have won probably on the spot, was rook c4 move. Well, it's very hard for a human to make this when all their pieces placed very well. And when you have possibility of playing e4 move with the potential e5, it's very difficult not to make this move and break the harmony of being bishop on b3 being very active and rook on d1 being protected. But rook c4 creates deadly threat of rook h4, and if knight g8 covering these squares, preparing h6. Then after rook f4, there is also almost no possible way black can keep this position together. f6, if f6 here, then that leads to instant mate. Actually, similar mating move was made in the game, but this was more forcing. And now knight f5 check, the only move king h8, and this leads to immediate mate to black's king. Queen g7 is a threat. Taking leads to instant mate, and black has no defense. However, e4 move, as strong as it looks, it's not as strong as rook c4, but it's good enough to win the game. Knight g8, rook d3, and after f6, played by black, same combination we just saw. Knight f5 check, king h8, queen g6. Tactical shot that Alekhine would never miss. From time to time in his personal life, he was drinking like every Russian. Otherwise, he wouldn't be Russian. He passed the test of being Russian by drinking from time to time. And even if he was drunk, he would not have missed queen takes g6. I don't think he ever missed a tactical shot in his career in the tournament, any tactical shot, for him or for his opponent. And in this position, former world champion Emanuel Lasker resigned. actually very spectacular. Same opening, same way of starting the middle game. And one of them ended with absolute devastating positional squeeze. And that was in earlier stage of Alekhine's career. And as he got older, he played absolutely brilliant attack from the same opening that led to mating his opponent's king. So I hope you enjoyed the lecture about one of the greatest players that ever lived, and you learned a lot. Thank you very much.